The final discussant is Jamie Drummond. Jamie is the Executive Director of One, whose mission is to help the world's poorest countries, especially in Africa, beating AIDS and achieving the Millennium Development Goals. Jamie was formerly the global strategist for the Jubilee 2000 campaign, and prior to that, he worked at Christian Aid. So, Jamie.
Thank you. And can you hear me? Is this working? So what I might do is just react, as Michael did, to some of the presentations and then make a few political observations about where we are and what might need to be done. And I think also maybe a little bit brainstorm. So, Guido, I was very surprised, if you can hear, that you said that the Africa, you went deep on Africa because you said it had the better data. And that's music to our ears, but I'm sceptical that that might be accurate. So I'd love to just press on how you felt that and would punch the air if we're convinced. So I'd love to understand that a bit better. But excellent presentation and very striking and reminding that for all of the media attention on climate change, the major costs remain in development, and that the portion, the increased costs caused by climate change are a fraction, 20%, and that's incredibly important to bear in mind. It also reminds us that, to some of Michael's points about climate change being used, and I think we need to be careful about using the word used, but climate change being used to market development, that one of the ways within that to think about it might be that there are some things such as the forgotten Millennium Development Goals. Education and health get a lot of attention. Agriculture traditionally until very recently was something forgotten about or talk about in quiet dark rooms because it's a bit embarrassing because we got it wrong for so long. And then water and sanitation, again, I'd say one of the more forgotten Millennium Goals. And so insofar as talking about climate change can help remind us of those forgotten pieces of the puzzle, that's a useful thing. But we talk to ourselves about who's using what, and are we mainly development people in this room, and are there any environmental people in the room who don't want to be used? And then Nicola, the UK example within the scenarios is quite instructive. Under your business as usual scenario, you say 0.7. Now, at Data and One, we spend all of our time trying to get people to keep those 0.7 promises. And we'd love that to be done. Obviously, we're in a country where miraculously all three parties at this moment in time, and we'll hear about it in the debates tonight, but over the course of the next few weeks, we'll hear more and more about all parties' commitment to 0.7. But within that, there's that important detail about the fact that climate finance is not additional to 0.7. Even in this country where the debate is so strong, support for development issues is so strong, and support for climate issues is relatively strong, no one's talking about additional to 0.7. It's a portion of 0.7, even from Labour. So that's a very interesting observation. If that's the template for business as usual, then I suspect, and this may not be what any of us want to hear, but it has to be played out as a scenario, that the great contribution that climate change discussions and energy create is that 0.7 will actually be kept, not just in this country, but in Europe as a whole and maybe elsewhere. And that may not be what we all want to hear, but it might be what actually occurs. And to better understand that potential is, I think, quite important. And thank you for reminding us that the fixation on additionality mustn't result in unnecessarily additional mechanisms. And that is the easy temptation, the bureaucratic tendency to think to prove something's additional, therefore we need another bunch of people keeping it separate, would be, in terms of policy here, disastrous. But it is probably what will happen. Currently, as things are going, that's probably what will happen. So, again, we can all think it's not the right thing to happen. It probably is what's going to happen unless we all pay a lot of attention. Finally, Jessica, under your scenarios, I think something we've all forgotten, which was in the African position initially, in Copenhagen, when it came to additionality of finance and finance for climate change, there were actually three pieces of the puzzle as we recall. One was fast-track financing. The other was, in 2020, an additional 100 billion. But there was a missing piece, well, there was an original middle piece, which was an additional 50 billion by 2015. And the reason that's so smart to have still in the package is the fast-track money's, I'm afraid, bullshit. It's not real new money. It never was going to be. It's money that's already happening, on the whole, that can be claimed as climate finance because it's doing similar kinds of things anyway. So let's call it climate finance to keep that constituency happy, but it's not new money. Then let's not spend any time pretending that it is, because it isn't, and it'll be a waste of time trying to do that. But similarly, in political terms, 2020 it's a decade ago away. We've just rediscovered how difficult it is to remind people in 2010 about promises in 2005. Try reminding people in 2020 about promises in 2010. It's politically meaningless, I'm afraid. So we have to find some interim targets which are additional, meaningful, that have grittiness and traction, that some people might be making promises in 2010 and 2011 who might actually be around to be held accountable for them around the middle of this decade. Now, the middle of this decade happens also to be the deadline for the Millennium Development Goals. So a 2015 interim target is essential, and without it, I wouldn't trust anything that anyone says about additionality whatsoever. So an additional 50 by 2015. I don't know why it got lost in the murk in Copenhagen. Maybe Michael or somebody else in the room knows why. I can't remember why. Maybe we dropped the ball on that too, but someone's got to pick up that fairly soon. In terms of overall sort of political situation, I think some of us have been, when we saw the 100 billion by 2020, I mean, you know, we've been talking with Michael about this and others, we all kind of thought, here we go again, on one level, which is the issue of additionality. I mean, it's, I've got a philosophy degree, unfortunately, and, you know, the concept of additionality, you could define it in so many ways, upon so many baselines and hypothetical scenarios, and it is a gift to politicians who are trying to make something sound new when it isn't necessarily. And so we have to be perk up our ears when a politician uses the word. Doesn't mean that when they use it they're being dishonest. It just means that we need to be very trust but verify in our approach. And when that 100 billion was floated, it's important that we say that's very important new money that must be new, and let's all work toward that goal with interim targets. But we should also ask a lot of questions about it and demand a process immediately following the announcement that makes sure it is as real as possible. So we've been bouncing around some ideas about some principles that would be required of any politician whenever they attempt to use the word additional. It'd be almost like a fair trade seal of approval or a brand mark for the politicians, so that a commentator, whether from civil society, a think tank, or the media, could immediately say, does it follow these principles? And the draft term is the track principles. Is a promise transparent, results-oriented? If it's claiming additionality insofar as is it additional, and what does that mean? Are there any conditionalities, and what is the independent mechanism to ensure it's kept? Very neat little acronym. It's still a draft proposal which we're banding around with various people, and would love feedback and comments on that from the group here. But it's a kind of a sort of a set of hygienic principles at the moment of the birth of these promises. I see Miles Wickstead in the back smiling. Of course, Miles chaired the Commission for Africa, and that was an amazing vehicle for delivering promises in 2005, the Gleneagles promises. Probably some of the better promises made in terms of its monitorability, but still very, very difficult. That was the additional 50 billion by 2010, with 25 of that for Africa that was promised in 2005. Since then, between Gleneagles and, if you like, Copenhagen, there was the Heiligen Dam 60 billion for health, largely reprogrammed old money. There's the 20 billion for L'Aquila for agriculture, largely reprogrammed old money, all of which claim degrees of additionality and degrees of purpose and focus, which I'm afraid weren't as there as ideally all of us would wish. So there's an overall thing about development here that's very important, and the fear is Copenhagen is actually at the worst end of the spectrum in terms of equality of promise. Then just an overall observation would be we talk about climate change too much as a thing that requires compensation for, and it is in many ways. But it's also, you know, somebody mentioned the opportunity, and I don't think just the opportunity from a marketing perspective, but the opportunity in terms of if you're in Africa, the potential for renewables is enormous, and so much of the infrastructure there is not yet built. There's an amazing opportunity there for them to do things that others are already too far down other roads to do. So Africa is a renewables hub, driving cleaner energy for a new industrial base there is an amazingly interesting idea. And we saw some presentations in the African Development Bank for the Lake Turkana wind project, wind farm, a couple of weeks ago in Kenya. It should go ahead. The financing isn't quite in place. If it does, I think they could supply 25% of the electricity needs of Kenya in the near future. And there are other important, whether it's hydro, which traditionally lots of groups associated with environmental development issues have been very wary of. So these major infrastructural regional projects that could drive, low carbon growth in Africa there needs to be important policy dialogue to make sure mistakes in the past aren't repeated, but get it right, and there's great potential. Nick Stern mentioned 1% as a kind of hybrid crossover compromise number, if you like. The originally 0.7 was actually part of a 1% promise in the 70s, and 0.7 ODA FDI was 0.3, equaling 1, and might take it personally. It's right. It seems that if we're going to try and do anything other than the business as usual approach, which will be the very hard to achieve 0.7 with climate within it, it can only be if we get quite a lot of very hard-headed policy agreement around a number above 0.7 that includes climate finance. And Nick floated 1%. Somebody should stress test that with a lot of research and grounding in further costs to development and additional costs because of climate change. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw during the course of the year not just a high-level panel on climate finance, but some kind of high-level panel on environment and development costs combined and mechanisms combined. How could that work? And let's remember that there is an actual Millennium Goal that's supposed to be about environmental sustainability. It's supposed to be part of the package. Let's try and keep it that way.
Good. Thank you very much, Jamie.